Hello, and welcome to The Explainer. You see it all the time, right? Polls telling us what we think, what we want, what we believe, but does all of that chatter actually add up to anything? When we speak up, are our leaders even listening? Today, we're diving into a really fundamental question. Does your voice actually matter?
You know, sometimes the whole national conversation doesn't just drift, it gets completely jolted. All it takes is one single seismic event, a moment that just grabs everyone by the collar and forces us all to look at some really uncomfortable truths.
And in that moment, when everyone's watching, that's when you really see the cracks in the foundation. That one event can suddenly reveal just how deeply divided we really are, exposing these fault lines that run right through our society, the ones we usually try to ignore. So this gets us to the big question. When the public is so clearly, so passionately split, what are lawmakers supposed to do? Is policy really shaped by what the people want, or is something else driving the bus? Let's dig in.
To really unpack this, we're going to look at a pivotal moment from recent history, the 2014 shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. That event and everything that followed became this incredibly powerful lens for looking at American public opinion.
Now, the thing about Ferguson is it didn't really create new divisions. It was more like it threw a giant spotlight on the ones that were already there. And it turns out, one of the best ways to predict how someone saw that event was their political party.
And I mean, just look at the data. The difference in perception is staggering. Depending on their politics, Americans had wildly different takeaways. Polls at the time showed most Republicans felt the issue of race was getting way too much attention. Meanwhile, a strong majority of Democrats believed the events raised important issues about race that we needed to talk about. They weren't just disagreeing on a detail. It was like they were experiencing two completely different realities.
And it goes way beyond politics. You see another deep divide that's really rooted in race and lived experience. As this chart makes pretty clear, a huge 80% of Black Americans and 63% of Hispanic Americans believe police sometimes treat minority groups unfairly. For white Americans, that number was way lower. This isn't just a difference of opinion, it's a reflection of totally different interactions with the justice system. And, the list goes on. These demographic divides don't stop there. Polls consistently show a gender gap on all sorts of issues, from how we spend money to military action. These different viewpoints often shape which political parties people lean towards, adding yet another layer of complexity for any lawmaker trying to get a read on the public.
So this creates a real problem, doesn't it? If you're a lawmaker and you're looking at a public that is so fundamentally split on huge issues, what do? Who are you supposed to listen to?
Well, political thinkers have basically two classic models for this. There's the delegate model, which says a representative's job is simple. Be a mouthpiece. Just do what the people who elected you want. But then there's the trustee model, and that argues a representative should use their own judgment and information to do what they think is best, even if it goes against the latest poll.
And, there's a pretty strong argument for that trustee idea. As one pollster put it pretty bluntly, sometimes the public is just plain wrong. Public understanding can be based on incomplete or even incorrect information. Which raises a huge question. Should policy be based on popular opinion if that opinion is totally out of whack with the facts?
And on top of that, you have to remember, polls themselves aren't perfect, not by a long shot. The way you word a question, or whether someone even knows much about the topic, can totally skew the results. As these analysts from the Brookings Institution said, treating poll numbers like they're the gospel truth, well, that's basically writing fiction.
Okay, so enough with the theory. How does this actually play out in the real world? Let's look at two big pieces of legislation that really highlight this whole thing. One where lawmakers listened, and one where, well, they didn't. Okay, first up, let's go back to the 1996 Welfare Reform Bill. At the time, public dissatisfaction with the welfare system was really high. A huge majority, we're talking 68% of Americans, supported the key parts of the reform, like adding work requirements and time limits. All right, now fast forward to 2017 and the big tax cut bill. The story here is completely different. Just a few weeks before it became law, polls showed that only about 3 in 10 Americans were actually in favor of it, a clear minority.
So here it is, laid out side by side. On one hand, you have Congress passing a bipartisan law that clearly had overwhelming public support. And on the other, you have Congress passing a law on a party line vote that most people were actively against.
And that gets us to the real puzzle here, doesn't it? If democracy is supposed to be about the will of the people, why on earth would elected officials knowingly pass a law that most of their own constituents don't even want?
Well, there are a few strategic reasons. They might just think it's good policy, and they're betting that public opinion will catch up once people see the results. Or they might be trying to fire up their party's base, their most loyal voters, right before an election. And then there's the big one: pressure from interest groups and donors.
And you don't even have to guess about that last point. During the debate over that 2017 tax bill, Congressman Chris Collins actually said this out loud. I mean, it's a pretty stunning admission of the massive pressure that political donors can put on the process, sometimes enough to just steamroll public opinion entirely.
But hold on, that is not the end of the story. Let's circle all the way back to Ferguson, because while lawmakers might be able to ignore a poll here or there, it's a whole lot harder for them to ignore sustained, vocal, and organized public pressure.
Just look at the difference a year can make. The first protests in 2014 were often met by police in full riot gear. But by the anniversary protests a year later, the New York Times was reporting a totally different scene. Officers in polo shirts talking calmly with demonstrators. That change in tactics didn't just happen. It was a direct result of a year of intense public scrutiny.
And that pressure didn't just stay on the streets. It forced its way onto the biggest political stages. By 2015, in the middle of a presidential debate, a questioner used the exact language of the protest movement, forcing the candidates to take a stand. Senator Bernie Sanders' direct reply, it just showed how much the movement had completely shifted the national conversation.
So make no mistake, the impact was real. The national dialogue changed. Powerful members of Congress flew to Ferguson not to lecture, but to listen and to promise they had firepower in Washington. Vows were made to push for major criminal justice reform. Sustained public opinion, shouted through protest, forced the political system to sit up and pay attention.
So, where does that leave us? Does public opinion matter?
The answer seems to be a complicated yes. A single poll can be brushed aside. But as we saw in Ferguson, when public pressure is loud, focused, and it doesn't let up, it becomes a force that's almost impossible to deny. It can change things on the ground and shift the entire national debate. The real challenge, as political scientist John Kingdon famously asked, is figuring out what exactly makes an idea's time come. And that's the puzzle at the very heart of democracy. Thanks for joining us.